Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. We're going to talk this week about something that is key to the Easter narrative. Now, whether you're watching this the week after Easter or before Easter or any other time during the year, I wanted to make a point about a most important piece of evidence in the claims of Christianity, in the Christian worldview, in the collection of evidences supporting the Christian worldview, and that is the resurrection. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, the letter he wrote to the Corinthian church, that if the resurrection is not true, we are to be pitied. For a couple of reasons. Number one, there is no real hope of resurrection for ourselves, of being brought back from the dead for ourselves, if the resurrection of Jesus is not true. Number two, we've been lied to. If the claims about the resurrection in the New Testament are false, the writers then have lied, and we have, unfortunately, if we believe this nonsense, have believed the lie, and we are to be pitied. Now, when I first read that, that was interesting to me as a guy who was not a Christian. As a guy who was a skeptic, I thought to myself, this is interesting because here is a guy who's doubling down on the claim, really, in the first century. Has a sense that, people are going to be skeptical when they first read this, when they first hear this. That's clear to Paul. And he doubles down on the claim here by saying, hey, we're not lying to you. And if we are lying to you, you've been duped, and this would be he recognizes this would be a bad thing. He actually calls it out for what people might suspect it to be, a lie, and then doubles down on the claim. So I thought this is interesting. It's worth us, I think, examining the claims of the resurrection, especially on Easter season. But really, if we're interested in truly examining the Christian worldview to see if it is true, we ought to look at this first key piece of evidence. And so today's show is really going to be all about whether or not you should even believe this claim and why some folks who don't believe it continue to resist it. So I want to talk about why some skeptics continue to resist the claim of the resurrection, what it is that's standing in their way, and I'm going to talk to you about it from my own experience. Now look, I know there's a danger in doing that for a couple of reasons. There's a danger in doing it because you don't want to extrapolate from your own personal experience and think that's true for every other skeptic in the world. So I'm going to speak now in from two kind of points of reference. One is my own personal point of reference as a guy who was an atheist until I was 35 and was looking at this claim. This claim of the resurrection was foundational to me personally. I needed to know if it was true, and I had some resistance to it, and I will examine that in a minute. So that's the first thing, my own personal point of reference. Also, I can tell you, though, as somebody who has now been speaking on this topic for years around the country to hundreds of audiences and probably about 100,000 people so far, I can tell you that I do hear a lot of the same kinds of objections related to the resurrection that I held for many years. So while this is my personal objection years ago, I do think it probably represents a large number of skeptics who continue to resist the claims of Christianity. I think this we're going to talk about today is the real reason why, a key reason why people still resist this. Now, I also want to share with you a little bit of my own journey so to make some context for this, so it makes some sense for this. And that is basically this. I was a guy who was really not interested in Christianity. As a matter of fact, the Christians I did know didn't seem to be able to represent their worldview very well. I either had believers who were officers who weren't really able to make a case for why Christianity was true, in spite of the fact they could make a case for why a particular suspect was the guy involved in a robbery series, for example. So they have a very kind of sequential, evidential approach to their professional work, and then when it came to their claims about Christianity, they would, really kind of say, well, this is one of those things you just have to believe. Well, that wasn't going to work for me as somebody who I just didn't understand why anyone who would take one kind of approach to everything else in their life would not then take the same kind of approach to the most important things in their life. So I just could not jump in with the kind of certainty that these folks seem to possess. The other thing, of course, I encountered were Christians who I would arrest. And these folks would claim to be Christians, but their behavior didn't seem to be all that much better than the other people who weren't Christians who I arrested. So I had a real problem not seeing what I thought was what if this is the kinds of people who are involved in this worldview. I just didn't have any interest in it. So that was part of it. And so when I first sat down with my wife, and she, had been trying to get me to go to church for a number of years, not because she was somebody who was herself a believer, because I think we would both say that we got saved at the same time, but she was far more interested than I was, and she at least had people in her family that she knew that kind of modeled this, and I didn't have that, so I just was a little bit different position than she was in. So when we first went to an evangelical church, and I heard the preacher talk about Jesus in a way that intrigued me, that I never thought you could talk about Jesus as just a really smart guy whose wisdom was so profound that it shaped all of Western civilization. And I thought, well, is that even true? That's a claim that I would want to examine to see if it was true. I think I would have been interested, right, in the kind of person that Jesus was, because I'd want to know what kind of a person really has that kind of wisdom, and what's the wisdom we're talking about that we say shapes all of Western culture. So I was interested in the person of Jesus for those narrow reasons, not because I was interested in God's existence, or even interested in whether or not Jesus was God. As a matter of fact, I would have rejected all of that for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. I was simply interested in whether or not there was wisdom from Jesus that I could glean to benefit from in my own personal life. And that's why I bought my first Pew Bible. I didn't spend a lot of money on this. I probably spent $6 to purchase that Bible. It was the kind of Bible you would typically see in the back of pews in churches. So it was the kind of thing that I felt like I could afford. And one of the Bibles as good as another. I had no idea what translation to buy, any of that. So I went out and bought a Bible. And I started to read through it just to get the wisdom statements of Jesus off the pages of the New Testament. My problem was, of course, that I started to see things on the pages of the New Testament because these wisdom statements are couched in Gospels. Gospels that seem to want us to believe that they actually include eyewitness observations of this guy named Jesus of Nazareth. People who were there and knew enough to see this, write it down, preserve it. If they did speak about it for some season before writing it down, that didn't bother me, because as a cold case detective, I already knew, as a detective back then anyway, I knew that that's often the case where you don't get to a witness until some period of time has gone by. And in some of my cases, there's 30 years have gone by before I could find a witness, and I'm supposed to trust that he's telling me something that's important, that's true about an event that occurred 30 years ago. I think you can actually hold on to those kinds of memories if the memories are of key events that are unique and powerful in the context of the observer's life. And that's certainly what these would have been. So I started to read through these eyewitness accounts and try to assess them to see how much of them I could trust. And of course, there's all kinds of miracles in these accounts. I just would skip over those, because I didn't believe you could trust those. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then I finally came to the biggest miracle of all, which is the resurrection of Jesus. So look, I at some point would have gotten to a place where I would have said that these accounts displayed some truth, some historical truth even, to an extent. But I would have said they certainly couldn't be true related to any of the miracles in those accounts. My perspective as an atheist was that I rejected the claims of the miraculous. So I was a committed philosophical naturalist in that sense. I did not believe that the supernatural existed, was reasonable. Didn't think it was reasonable. And so I would have said that the historical accounts we see in the Gospels are some form of historical fiction, in which there are key pieces of the account that are rooted in history to convince us of something, yet there are other pieces of the account that are entirely fictional. And I would have always said the pieces that are fictional are those places in the account where Jesus either heals somebody, works a miracle, feeds 5,000, 4,000, whatever the case may be, and certainly him rising from the dead and ascending into heaven. These are the supernatural elements of first century writing, which you see in other forms of ancient text also, that I would have said were the insertions, the things that can't be true, because of my position as a philosophical naturalist. Look, you can't insert the supernatural into history and still call it history. If you're going to do that, you now have stepped out of a genre we call history, and you're now in a genre we would call mythology. So we can't be doing that. We also can't step out of the natural sciences and try to jam in supernatural explanations. I would have said you stepped out of science the minute you did that. So this is where I stood for a long time. And as I read through the accounts of the Gospels, I did realize that, wow, except for the miracles, these things pass the test. In all the ways that I would apply what I knew for reliability in eyewitnesses as a detective, the 4 things I looked for: were they really there? Can they be corroborated in some way? I don't expect full corroboration, because you never get an eyewitness who's fully corroborated. You get what I call touch point corroboration. So are these Gospels at least corroborated in a touch point sense? They are. And third, do we think they've been transmitted to us? Do you think this guy's ever changed his story? Because if a witness changes his story over time, you can't trust him. And so I needed to test the Gospels to see if they'd ever changed their story about Jesus over time. And the fourth thing, of course, is bias. Do you have, do the writers of these accounts have so much skin in the game that they are willing to lie because they are trying to give themselves some kind of advantage? And of course, advantage is driven by only 3 motives. A desire to do something wrong, like lie, is only driven by 3 motives. The same 3 motives that drive all homicides: money, sex, relationships, and power. These are the 3 things that motivate anyone to do something they shouldn't do. And so I looked for those 3 motives in the lives of the 12, or at least in the lives of the authors, and for the life of me, I could not find anything that would incline me to believe that these were not reliable eyewitness accounts. And this is really what I tried to write about at length in a book that I call Cold Case Christianity. And so this book really tries to go through the entire evidence set that I looked at, looking at those 4-part template that we use in jury trials. By the way, that 4-part template comes from the California jury instruction for eyewitnesses. And so I really am looking at the same template to ask this question: can we trust these eyewitnesses? So given that template, I really came to the conclusion that these were reliable to the point of the miracles. And that's when I had to ask a secondary question. Jim, why is it that you stop short of the entire account? Why is it you don't think everything in there is reliable? Well, because there's miracles. Okay, well, I'm a philosophical naturalist. I knew that, and I wanted to really ask myself and be fair. So I started to ask this more important question, which is, can my philosophical naturalism explain the universe the way it is? In other words, was I warranted in being a philosophical naturalist? Or was there good reason to reject my own skepticism about the supernatural? In other words, I wanted to know, why do I reject miracles? Do I have good grounds to reject miracles? And so that's when I took a second step in the investigation. So for me, it wasn't about, well, is there God? Does God exist? And if God does exist, is Christianity true? That's kind of you can see the building blocks there you might take to get to a position of Christian theism. That wasn't my journey. My journey was exactly the opposite. I just happened to get interested in the person of Jesus, then became curious about the gospel accounts containing the information about the person of Jesus. And once I found those were reliable to a point, then I became interested in the evidence in the universe, and could my philosophical naturalism explain this evidence? And that became an even bigger issue for me, and that's the topic of my second book, which is called God's Crime Scene. So I wrote the books in the same order of my personal journey. First, through the Gospels, are they reliable? Second, should I believe the miracle parts? Because that's really an investigation about whether or not there's good reason. Can my philosophical naturalism explain the 8 pieces of evidence that are in the room of the universe? Remember, that's my paradigm for this book, is simply this. If you enter a crime scene, a death scene, for example, and you want to know if it's a murder or just a natural death or a suicide or an accident, it really comes down to one question. Can you explain everything you see in the room by staying in the room? If all the evidence you explain in that room can be explained by staying in the room, you got no evidence of an intruder. If this guy lives alone, for example, and you have everything you see in that room, from the pistol to the note to any of the other evidence in the room, can be explained without you having to go outside the room, then you've got no reason to believe there's an intruder in that room. That's probably a suicide, or that's an accidental. But that's not going to be a homicide. Once you've got reason to believe you can't explain the evidence in the room by staying inside the room, now you've got to look to the outside of the room, evidence of an intruder, and try to explain how that evidence got in the room. Well, that's a problem. And that's the problem I had as I examined the evidence in the universe. 8 pieces of evidence in the universe that everyone has to explain. The origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life in the universe, the fine-tuning and design we see in biology, consciousness, free agency, objective transcendent moral truths, and evil. Everyone has to explain how these 8 things get in the room. If you can't explain them by staying inside the natural universe, just using the stuff that's in the room, that space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry that govern space, time, and matter, well, then you've got a problem. Because really, if you have to go outside the natural realm of the universe to explain the stuff that's inside the natural realm of the universe, you've got a cosmic level intruder. And what in the world would that be? Who in the world would that be? So as I examined my own naturalism, and examined the 8 things that were in the room, I came to the determination that I really couldn't explain those as a naturalist. As a matter of fact, try as I might, the best and most reasonable inference pointed to something, someone, a personal being as a first cause that's non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, that's outside the room, that is the source of all information inside the room, and the source of consciousness, free agency, objective moral truth, and evil, at least by which the standard of this being outside the room is the straight line by which we measure anything crooked. So evil even requires this objective standard of good in order to call anything truly evil. And that is where I ended up saying, okay, I think I can now go back to my investigation of the Gospels, and I don't have really good reason to reject that something miraculous could happen if this being that's responsible for all 8 things in the room of the universe actually created the universe. That being could probably pull off every miracle in the New Testament in the blink of an eye without much effort. And that's why I said, you know what, this actually is reasonable. Now we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what I think is the key reason why skeptics look at the resurrection claims made by the Christians they know, and they reject them. And it'll help you, I think, number one, if you are a skeptic who's still wondering if this is true, kind of work through your own skepticism. And 2, if you're trying to reach somebody who's skeptical, I think it might help you understand where they're coming from. And we'll do that right after the break.
Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
My name is J. Warner Wallace, and I'm a cold case homicide detective. Cold case investigations can teach us a lot about how to investigate the claims of Christianity. Cold case detectives examine events in the distant past for which there are often no living eyewitnesses and little, if any, forensic evidence. The Gospels also record an event in the distant past for which there are no living eyewitnesses and no forensic evidence. The skills I've learned as a cold case detective can help you determine if the Gospels are true. Are the Gospel writers reliable eyewitnesses? Can they be trusted? Has their testimony been corrupted over the years? What can we conclude about Jesus from the Gospel eyewitness accounts? I hope you'll read Cold Case Christianity to discover how evidence is examined and what this evidence tells us about Jesus. Take another look at the claims of Christianity from the perspective of a detective.
Connect with Cold Case Christianity on social media. Visit the Cold Case Christianity homepage and click the social media icons on the top right toolbar. Jim is active on Facebook and Twitter, posting the best apologetics articles from over 250 Christian blogs around the country. You'll also find links to Jim's Instagram, Pinterest, and Google Plus accounts, along with the link to the Cold Case Christianity YouTube page. Stay connected with Cold Case Christianity and become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, let's talk about now the key reason why I think a lot of skeptics reject the resurrection. It really comes down to how we try to explain the evidence in the room. Remember, when we look at evidence in any case, we compare a list of evidences to a list of explanations. So let's do that right now when it comes to the resurrection. As an atheist, I would have given you several key pieces of evidence that I believe were true, even though I was not a Christian. And these pieces of evidence really are, I think, rather non-controversial, although I think recently we have seen people try to knock holes even in these basic pieces of evidence. But here they are. I would have said that, yes, Jesus was crucified. He was buried. I was not a Jesus myther. I've done shows here talking about that, so I won't go into the details there. I think you could believe that, though, and not be a Christian. You can explain these facts, this fact, in many other ways without having to embrace any Christian explanation. I also would have said that the tomb was empty and that they never were able to produce the body, because if you want to end this in the first century, you simply get the body of Jesus and drag it around town. The fact that the tomb is empty and that there is no body does not mean Christianity is true. You can believe that even as an atheist, because I could explain that in a number of ways. Maybe somebody stole the body. I could explain it in a number of different ways. The third thing I would say is that the disciples they believed this, and well, even if I didn't say they believed it, I would say they certainly claimed that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. But you could explain that in a number of ways. And even if they did believe it, it doesn't make it true. But people believe all kinds of crazy things. That doesn't mean that these things are true. So I think you can hold these first three positions, and even the fourth, that if you trust what we see in Scripture about kind of the nature of the disciples, it does seem, even without them making a big deal about it, it does seem that they're much bolder after the resurrection than they were before the resurrection. So take a look at those four. I think you could believe those as an atheist. And I did, because these things do not mean Christianity is true. You could explain them a number of other ways, as you see over here. Maybe they were just wrong. Jesus wasn't really dead on that cross, so he didn't really rise from the dead. Maybe they were just lying. Maybe they hallucinated this. Maybe they were fooled by an imposter, or they were influenced by one person who had a vision, who had great influence with the group, or maybe they were late legend. The resurrection didn't actually occur, but it's a legend that grew over time. These are all 6 explanations that you could hold as a non-believer to explain the bare minimum evidence in the room. And of course, there's the last explanation that they're just accurate. This is just the truth about what happened, that the record actually records the truth. Now, I would have said that last one can't be true, but I would have said that the other ones had some good, reasonable possibilities. I mean, some really good explanations. Now, I went through all of them as a skeptic, and I started to look and see, there's just some fatal flaws, really, in any of the first 6 explanations. You could argue that they're just wrong, but I mean, I know enough about what dead people look like. And I talk about this both in my book and in all the videos we've done online. I just can't imagine that someone in the first century would not know that Jesus is actually dead, given the hidden science in the Scripture describing the death of Jesus. I also don't think it's a conspiracy, given what I know about how conspiracies work, how we investigate conspiracies, and what's required for successful conspiracies. This is something else I talk about in Cold Case Christianity. I also didn't think these were hallucinations, given the fact that it's pretty hard to explain detailed group hallucinations where more than one person is reporting the same thing. And I didn't think they were fooled by an imposter, because whoever it is who's after the grave with Jesus, he's working the same kinds of miracles as the Jesus before the grave. You're stuck with a miraculous version of Jesus, and that imposter would have to be divine in order to pull this off. Then if he's divine, you don't need an imposter. And then, of course, you've got the issue of influence, and I went through all of these. Even the idea that these were distorted later by his legends. That requires, if you're going to be a late legend, you need to be both late and a legend. They're neither. They're neither late, and they haven't changed and added a legendary components. That didn't happen over time. So that's the problem we have, is that as you look at all 6 of these explanations, they have fatal flaws. Well, look, I expect that every explanation, even the true explanation, will have both advantages, virtues, and liabilities, right? Good things and bad things. Things that are really great at explaining the evidence, and then some liabilities, some things that don't make any sense. some weaknesses, strengths and weaknesses. Well, it turns out these have more weaknesses than they have strengths. Now, to get to the last explanation, that's the Christian one. Did Jesus just rise from the dead? I would have said that's got some strengths. It does certainly explain the evidence well, but it's got a huge weakness. It requires me to believe in a resurrection. And that is what keeps most of us from accepting this explanation. I would have said that I don't believe in anything supernatural. So therefore, that is out of the question. But here's my problem. What we're examining when we're examining the resurrection is whether or not supernatural events like the resurrection are reasonable. In other words, this is the focus of our investigation. You cannot begin this investigation by rejecting the supernatural outright. That's what you're investigating. You got to at least suspend your disbelief. Well, here's the problem though. If you don't suspend your disbelief, I can show you some evidence to support the reliability of the Scripture, maybe how early they were written. You're going to find a way to jump over that because you're committed to your philosophical naturalism. You reject miracles. Well, then I can show you maybe how often they're written about, these accounts, by outside sources. I don't care. I reject miracles. This can't be true. I could show you how archaeological discoveries support the Scriptures. You're going to say, I don't care. I'll find a way to jump over that. And no matter what I show you, you will continue to find ways to jump over all the evidence in front of you because you're committed to this conclusion that supernaturalism is not reasonable. And the reason why you're committed to that is because that's where you began, with the assumption that supernaturalism is not possible. That, my friends, is called circular reasoning, where you start with your conclusion and you find a way to get back to it again. That is not fair, and that's not a good way to conduct investigations. So when it comes down to the resurrection of Jesus, it's one of two things. Either Jesus rose from the dead, or he didn't, when you're asking what happened to Jesus. Okay, so we got to look at both of these possibilities. If you're asking me to accept all kinds of evidence, including the supernatural explanations for that evidence, I would have said, I'm out, because I have a roadblock in my way called my disbelief about anything supernatural. But here's the problem. All the naturalistic explanations that I offered, that anyone's ever offered, are all fatally flawed. These are huge roadblocks. I didn't care though. I would find a way to jump over these. I'll find a way to go under these, find a way to go around these, because I was committed to that end, that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Even though every explanation that might explain the evidence is fatally flawed. Well, it turns out there's a roadblock over here, but unlike these, I'm the only reason why it's there. I can't control how bad these fatal flaws are, but the only reason why this stands in my path is me. So I could simply remove it. And if I removed it, there would be no roadblock. This would be by far be the most reasonable inference from evidence. I was the reason why I rejected that. So in the end, I was able to get here once I realized I was the only thing keeping me from there. So as you talk to your friends during this season or any time of the year, making the case for the most important piece of evidence in the Christian worldview, keep in mind that sometimes the only real obstacle is the person you're talking to. So help them to see the problem with their presuppositions. That being said, I hope this helps you make the case for what you believe as a Christian, and I'll see you right here next time at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.